Okay, and now I'm just going to introduce you to the 5 cemeteries, and we'll be showing you a series of graphs. And it's important not necessarily to look at the percentages or look at, specifically, what grave types we're talking about. But all the different colors correspond in the pie chart to different grave types. And you'll notice that the grave types that are present and the sort of distribution or the frequencies of grave types in a certain space are not going to be the same across any of the other cemeteries. They're all very unique. Okay, so our first cemetery is in United States. This was a community that was composed of the individuals that came from five former plantation settlements, and our first written inscriptions come from the 19th century. So this is still one of the 3 very active cemeteries. It's one of the larger cemeteries. And on the next slide, we'll show you sort of the grave type distribution, just so you can get an idea. Okay, so this is the cemetery at Farquharson. So you can see it's sort of on a hill. So this is one of the spaces that was a little bit more difficult to sort of date. Headstones can move, and especially you can tell that there's some hurricane damage there, that there's some sort of movement from the sort of unstable sand and soil. So Farquharson's is not really used anymore. It's only maintained. There's only 1 resident left in Farquharson settlement, and there are 28 identifiable graves in Farquharson Cemetery. And if you remember the distribution from the last cemetery, you can see that the way that Farquharson Cemetery is sort of organized in terms of grave types is very different. Okay, this is the cemetery at Sugarloaf. You can see it's a little bit, it's sort of situated a little bit differently. You can see that you have the ocean in the background, and that it's sort of mostly sort of just sand. This is one of the cemeteries that's sort of located away from the sort of current highway, and this is one of the other cemeteries aside from United States that shows any kind of expansion, and there are 48 graves in the cemetery. And this also has sort of a unique distribution and frequency in terms of grave types. Okay, this is the cemetery at Coburn town. You can see this is sort of close to where people are actually living. This was also the location of the British Commissioner's office, and as a result, we see a lot of grave types in this space that can be attributed to European or American lineages because of that connection. And this is one of the larger cemeteries. There are 179 graves. And as you can see, the distribution, again, to sort of beat that horse, is different. And then our final cemetery is North Victoria Hill. This is also very close to sort of the residential space. The cemetery hasn't been expanded. There are no modern graves. This is another space that is no longer active, but it is certainly maintained, and there are 38 graves in this area. And as you can see, we have a very wide distribution of different types of graves in this space. Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to swoop in here on the end and tell you what that all meant. So there are 4 sort of things that we can say sort of in a very general way by looking at these cemeteries on San Salvador. And the very first thing is, and it's something that's quite interesting, is San Salvador is a large island. It's about 32 square miles in size, mostly inland lakes. The settlements we know historically in the 19th century are connected. There are lots of references in the island commissioner's reports about people using the inland lakes to move from one side of the island to the next. There's a well-trodden road between the area between the Farquharson Cemetery and Settlement and the United States Cemetery and Settlement. So these areas are very well connected. People are getting around the island, but they're choosing to do very different things in their cemeteries. That's interesting. Right? It's not a lot of space. It's about 200 to 300 people on this island, we know from census, at any given time. And yet, the island looks very different if you look at how they're choosing to commemorate people in each of these different types of communities. And that says a lot about how communities are staking a claim about beliefs, about practices, about family traditions, very locally, even on a single island. And one of the things that I sort of, when I gave this paper to a group of archaeologists, is I said, this shows why we have to be careful. You excavate one site on an island and you can't say the site tells you about the whole island. This shows you that each little part of an island can tell you a very different story. So we have to think about what islands mean in different time periods other than our own, where we know how they're connected to one another in the nation. So it's not the same. Is that it's also clear that while there are clear differences among communities in terms of what people prefer, what the dominant forms of grave treatments are, there is also some sort of connection between communities. So on the right are some of these sarcophagi. We call them sarcophagi for no reason other than that's what I decided to call them the first time I saw them, because that's sort of what they look best like. They also seem to be reasonable attempts at imitation of some of the tabletop graves that are very common in Nassau cemeteries and American British cemeteries, where you have an above ground vault that doesn't actually, the burial is still underground, but you create these tabletops. If any of you have been to Exuma and gone to a lot of the historic cemeteries there where there's small family plots, those are what you see. So this may be connected to this type of an idea of burials. The sarcophagi here are from Coburn town on the right. It's the most common grave type in the cemetery. So again, they're not marked, we can't date them. And then they show up nowhere else on the island except for there's one of them in North Victoria Hill, and it's very well rendered. So the next cemetery over, that idea, that practice, that's an archaeological understanding, is that ideas move with people, move with objects. So when things look the same in two different places, it's because people in those places were communicating, sharing ideas, talking to one another, had some kind of a relationship. So while there's this real difference, you can also perhaps through any social interaction. So communities are certainly not isolated, but which makes the difference even more interesting. Go ahead. There's no pretty picture here, but what's particularly interesting is when you look at the archaeological record through the work that John Burton and I have been doing at the settlement of Polly Hill and at other plantations that have a clear time. Our plantations that we're looking at are starting in the 1780s and 1790s, and we can see them continuing and transforming over emancipation, transforming into villages during sharecropping periods even later on. And what we can see happening across the island of San Salvador is that diet is becoming the same. So there's a uniformity in diet, something we can see archaeologically. There's something very similar starting to happen in terms of a vernacular form of architecture. In fact, these outdoor kitchens behind houses start in the mid-19th century around the same time as these cemeteries. So archaeologically, we can see things like diet and house type are starting to look similar around the island at the same time that the graves aren't. That's even more interesting, just that burials are doing something different, that there's a different sort of practice going on and people are treating, this type of event and ritual very differently than their daily lives. It's an interesting point as well. And then our final thing that we can say, go ahead, Michael, is that the first time we see some kind of island-wide unity is very recent. So this is a late 20th century phenomenon. This is the first time you can say, and it has something to do with the presence of inscriptions, but really this kind of uniformity is something we only see across cemeteries now. It's something that begins sort of in the 1960s, 1970s, and it's the first time you see sort of the most common grave type appearing across the island. They also are the first time where you can look at a grave type and say, boy, I've seen these in Nassau, I've seen them on Exuma, I've seen them on Eleuthera, I've seen them in other places. So it's very interesting that these things that are very local, national, very island-wide at this particular later time. And again, it kind of underscores the interesting question of what's happening during this about 90-year, 100-year period where we can't date the graves because of the absence of inscriptions. But we know something's on there. So it's an interesting sort of suite of things that we can gather from that.